one of the most important things to be able to do, as I think, as an architect and a contractor type person in the building world, and also as a real estate investor, is be able to read structure. So when you look at older buildings, the structure is usually fairly apparent. And what's cool about old buildings is they settle and they move. And so you can see the effects of load path and, a column bearing on top of a beam that wasn't quite big enough. You can see the effects of that because it's been hundreds of years. So it's a structural lesson just waiting to be unpacked.
Your network is your net worth. Come listen to some of the most successful people I know share invaluable knowledge, stories, and advice in real estate, business, and beyond. This is Weiss Advice. Whether you want to take your business or personal life to the next level, look no further.
Welcome back to another episode of Weiss Advice. I'm your host, Yona Weiss. Great to be here on another wonderful day with another wonderful guest. We have Marilyn Moedinger on the show. Welcome to Weiss Advice.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here.
Talking into the abyss, assuming there are people actually listening to this. But yeah, I hope there are. I know there are. Thank you all for our listeners also. It's great to provide you with so many great content, just interviewing people and getting to know people around the real estate world. And Marilyn is one who I've come to know quite recently. In fact, we shared a dinner together about a month ago in New York, which is quite fascinating. A bunch of people coming together from Twitter, of all places, and meeting up in a kosher restaurant in Manhattan, which was pretty cool. And Marilyn is coming from Boston, where she is an architect and spends her time between Boston and Lancaster, Pennsylvania, right? We actually share some common roots there, but we'll get to that, hopefully. I'd love for you to give a little more of our listeners some more background for those who don't know who you are.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll start at the very beginning, which is to say that I was born and raised in Lancaster, Pennsylvania on a farm. And I had not really had any sort of contact with anyone who was in the architecture world or anything like that, but soon figured out that it was a great place for me to go to school. So I went for architecture school at University of Virginia, loved it, loved every second of it. And after that, I decided that I wanted to learn how to build things out in the field. So I got a job as a construction laborer out of college. I did that. There's some fun stories there. And eventually worked my way into the office at a general contractor, where I was an estimator, an assistant project manager, and then a project manager. So I ran projects. I was a general contractor. And I did that for, 3 or 4 years, and then went back to school for my master's in architecture. And then I moved to Boston because there was a recession, and that's where a sort of a job was. Okay. So I took it, moved to Boston, worked for an architecture firm there. So I actually didn't work for an architecture firm as an architect until I was in my late 20s. Worked there for a couple of years, did multifamily mostly. So that's where I got my multifamily chops.
Sure.
And then from there, I actually shifted gears and went into higher ed and was an administrator at a design school. I worked with students, pairing groups of students with nonprofits to do design build projects.
Wow.
We did like 60 projects during my time there. Lots of logistics, lots of organization.
Yeah, that's amazing.
But it was clear to me that while I love the work with students and while I love all that logistical stuff, I wanted to be out in the field and building again. So sort of accidentally started an architecture firm in 2013. So, and then since then, I've been running the company. Sideline to that, I've been buying real estate along the way and figuring that out, which is this whole other story as well. So owner operator of a couple small properties and do that as well.
Yeah. So and that's amazing. I mean, and you come from it because of your background and the work that you did as a general contractor and as an architect and design. You really have so many components to real estate that most real estate investors do not have. And I think running a business is part of owning real estate and investing, having money and capital, whatever, or having partners to do that with is one thing that a lot of people focus on in the management, asset management, but the construction and the design is such, I wouldn't say different, like so different. There are plenty of people that have that, but a less sought after skill set that really kind of sets you apart from a lot of other, just personally guests that I've had on the show who are real estate investors. So I'm really excited to dig into all this. And you continue to teach, is that correct, as an adjunct professor of
Yes.
architecture?
Yeah, I do. So I'm not teaching right now, but I've taught off and on, mostly on for the last 10 or 12 years. So teaching everything from design to sort of construction detailing and stuff like that, helping architecture students understand that kind of stuff, professional practice courses, theory courses, building science, all kinds of stuff.
That's amazing. Wow. I mean, so it's really a lot going on. How do you manage to balance all of this? That's the really question.
Well, I think, first of all, they all feed into each other. So
That's true.
there's a pretty serious overlap. And they not only feed each other in sort of a business sense or a logistical sense, but also in like a soul sense. So right when you're just like sick and tired of like dealing with difficult business issues, or this thing is taking a long time to get through zoning, or something that's really thorny, you get into the classroom and you're around students who are super passionate and super excited to learn this stuff. And so for me, having a balance like that is actually fruitful. I have to be careful that I don't let it get away from me. So I say no to a lot more these days than I used to. And that's hard, but it's important.
Absolutely. And that's quite refreshing, being able to be around students and people who are really new and are thirsting for the knowledge that you have and the experience that you have. And it's great to have that outlet to be able to share that. I mean, and get paid for it. So that's also pretty cool. But you've done some, like you mentioned, a few smaller projects. But one of those projects, I remember when we met, you were talking about restoring this property in Lancaster, this farm that's been in your family for a couple centuries. I mean, that's pretty awesome. Tell me more about that and what that project actually looks like.
Yeah. So I grew up on a farm, and that has been in our family since 1711. So pretty wild. And there I restored a house that is located here. So it was built in 1730. And by my great times, it depends on how you count it, 10, 11, 12, like, I don't know, it's sort of misty. We have the genealogy, but like, who is the guy who built it? It was a multi-generational thing,
right,
back in those days. So yeah, but basically by one of my great, grandfathers. And that's actually where I'm right now.
Oh, wow. So
yeah,
that definitely doesn't look like it was built in 1730. So you took this structure. I'm just curious, like structures that were built, way back when typically hold up a lot better than structures now. And I'm curious how you see that as an architect, and like, in terms of, are you able to adapt certain building techniques that were done, way back when to what you do now?
Yeah. So one of the most important things to be able to do, as I think, as an architect and a contractor type person in the building world, and also as a real estate investor, is be able to read structure. So when you look at older buildings, the structure is usually fairly apparent. And what's cool about old buildings is they settle and they move. And so you can see the effects of load path and, a column bearing on top of a beam that wasn't quite big enough. You can see the effects of that because it's been hundreds of years. So it's a structural lesson just waiting to be unpacked.
Wow.
So I was looking at a property recently to purchase as an investment, for example. And, I can read these 150-year-old buildings really quickly because of the experience of this project, but also all of our work is on old buildings mostly. In the Boston area, there's just not a lot of, if it's ground up, it's a big multifamily project. Sure. You're not doing, but a lot of multifamilies are rehabs and things like that. So you get really good at reading the structure. And in older buildings, the structure is often much easier to see. There's just fewer layers than modern buildings.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really important point about the layers. People used stone back then and wood.
That's right. And that's it.
And that's it, right? They didn't have too much else. When you're dealing with like a restoration, had this property that you're in right now, had it been restored, I mean, for 100 years, I'm sure that there had been some improvements and things like that done over the years, or centuries, I should say. Had it been restored like multiple times and you had to like peel back and discover things?
Well, we were fortunate in the fact that the last major renovation was in 1810. And we know that because I actually had a dendrochronologist come in and date the logs. So there's this amazing technique where they can, if certain size logs in certain sort of situations, they can actually do a core sample and date the logs and tell you when they were felled and where they came from. Yeah, it's amazing. Science is cool.
That's so cool.
So we knew that there were certain major renovations in 1810, which is also when it sort of corresponds to when the family the farm was established and they were a little more prosperous and they had expanded and built another house for more generations. And so it sort of corresponds with the family history as well. But it's still just a cube. Like they didn't add on, they just added up kind of. And then basically it wasn't touched until the 50s, the 1950s.
All right.
I guess I have to clarify. And at that point, that was the last major renovation, was 1952 or 3. So yeah, I found all kinds of weird things in here but it was pretty much a blank slate. That knob and tube wiring that was active.
Wow.
Yeah. For the first half of the job, I was worried that I was going to be the generation that burnt it down because I was running all these power tools off knob and tube. So we took care of that as fast as we could.
Wow.
But yeah, it was cool.
That's amazing. And it's also amazing to see kind of the progression, because obviously you had generations that were not running on electricity obviously there was no electricity. And maybe in places where you live, people didn't use electricity on purpose either.
That's right. Yes. All my ancestors were Mennonites, so they adopted that stuff a little slower.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so fascinating. And it's cool to see that you're actually living there and it's a real, space, has so much history to it.
Mm-hmm.
I assume there's other family members that still live in close proximity or.
Yes.
Even in the house itself.
Yes, for sure. So it's really special to be able to spend so much time with family close by, for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. How did they take to your coming in and saying, hey, I want to totally redo this place?
Well, I think, first of all, it needed to be done. So I think everyone was happy that I was coming in to do it, because otherwise,
right.
There's only so much each person can do.
Right.
And so having some more firepower. And I think, I know it was welcomed. I hosted Thanksgiving here with everybody and it was really, really nice. So
that's so nice. Very cool.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you about riding through a Mongolian desert on horseback, trying to find housing patterns and things, because obviously that's something that most of us do. I mean, everyone takes time off to go, trotting through the desert at a certain point in our life or time. But what was that? Was this just a trip you did at a certain point in time? What was that trip all about? And I'm sure you have some stories you'd like to share with us here.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I feel like I should say this was from a picture that I tweeted yesterday. Sort of randomly, it popped up on my phone as a timeline thing. And I was like, oh, right, that's fun. That time that I did that. So that was actually part of a larger trip that I had won a fellowship from the SOM Foundation. SOM is a big architecture firm. And I won their big fellowship one year and basically got $50,000 to travel around the world. So That's what I did. So I was researching vernacular residential architecture and climate mediation strategies within that on a line of longitude. So I started in my hometown and I drew a line sort of the long way around the globe and then hit a bunch of spots. So I was in Jamaica, I was in Peru, and then on the other side of the world, I was in Mongolia. I had some forays into some other places that were off the line. Like you're kind of there, so you should go to those places too.
Sure, yeah.
And I was in Beijing and Seoul, Singapore. I was in Malaysia, Vietnam, Australia. So it was amazing.
That's so cool.
So the picture was me riding across the Gobi Desert on a horse. So one of my other sort of sub things that I was up to was, how do I travel in the most so I tried not to fly whenever I could. I mean, obviously you fly when you have to go over an ocean. I guess you don't have to, but that's what I did. But I tried to take the train or other sort of ground transportation so that you can meet people when you do that. I have friends that I met on that trip that I still keep in touch with from all over the world. And you also get a sense for time and space in a different way. So you can really see where you are. Mm-hmm. Airports tend to be really far out of city centers. And when you're on a train for 30 or 50 hours, you really get a sense of where you are and how big places are. So I was traveling in Mongolia. I was traveling between nomadic. So people in Mongolia are traditionally nomadic. So I was traveling between sort of nomadic families who were set up to host, who volunteered to host people like me who would do this. Wow. And so I was studying there. I mean, studying sounds a little funny. I was basically a guest of theirs and learning about how they live. Most people call them yurts, but that's the Russian word. So I use the word gur, which is a Mongolian word since I was in Mongolia, but they're basically living the same way that they have for about 1,000 years, plus solar panels and cell phones.
Wow. So, yeah, I mean, a lot's changed, but at the same time, not a lot's changed, right?
Exactly.
And so what were some of the housing, what did that actually look like? I mean, if you're saying they live the same way, like how did they live?
Well, what's fascinating to me, especially about Mongolian Gurs, is that if you come up with a housing solution that works and you came up with it 1,000 years ago and it still works, there's something to that, right? Like I wanted to understand, and by the way, it's modular. So and it's all kit parts. So you would go to the market in Ulaanbaatar and you would go down the aisle, and this was like the aisle with all the tent poles, and this is the aisle with all the side of the tent flaps, and this is the aisle with, and they're all made the same ways. So you can go, you get to town and you're like, I need 3 new tent poles. You go and you get them and they'll fit your gur.
Wow.
So what's amazing to me about that, and that's what I was studying, is like, what does it mean for someone to have solved, like we're always trying to solve housing. And we're always trying to say like, what's, whether it's modular or, the next big thing, or how do we make housing that's comfortable, that's repeatable? Investors want that. Architects want that. Everybody wants that. How do we solve housing? It's a perennial problem. Well, let's look to cultures that solved it so well that they're living in houses that are still comfortable, usable, and viable 1,000 years later. And there's no need to change it. And it suits their living. I mean, they're nomadic. So obviously being able to pack up your house is a big deal.
Sure.
But also there's plenty of people who live in the city who still live in their gur in the city. So that, to me, that's the fascinating part. So I was in search of housing types that still work hundreds of years later, or even 1,000 years later.
That's fascinating. So my question to you about that trip, and obviously studying and learning so much around, not just from the Mongolian people there, but you traveled to a lot of places and probably learned a lot of things from these different cultures around the world. I mean, Jamaica and Peru and Singapore. I mean, there's really so much diversity there. Mm-hmm. I'm curious how much, or if any of that, have you taken back to what you do on your day-to-day? I mean, you run an architect firm based in Boston. I assume most of the housing that you're building or designing are in city centers, or, at least, suburbs. So, I mean, how do you take things from, I guess, from outside of, from very urban type places and bring it to the city?
Yeah. I mean, I would say the bulk of what I did study on my trip was urban. So Mongolia was sort of the outlier in terms of,
gotcha.
expansive. I mean, the Gobi Desert is like pretty wild, but so I was studying urban things from different eras, mm-hmm. and also completely modern, vernacular architecture doesn't necessarily mean old. It just means built without architects. So that's the vast majority of what people everywhere live in. Most people don't have an architect designed house or apartment or whatever that they live in. So, the things that I take from it, I'll tell you what I don't take from it. What everyone expects me to say is, well, I found this like cool window that now I copy and put it into how, like, none of that. What it is it's a way of living in a house. So when people live in a house that they know really, really well, or that they built themselves, or that is culturally very connected to the way that they're living sort of culturally, then they operate their house in a different way. I was looking at houses that were mostly, they didn't have like sort of HVAC systems in the way that most American houses have them or whatever. Some of them didn't have electricity. Most of them did, but the people interacted with their climate and their house in a much more integral way. Mm. In the morning, you would open this set of shutters on this side of the house because that's where the breeze is coming from the ocean, and you want to capture that in the morning because in the afternoon it gets really stifling. So you open the windows on this other side. So people were deeply connected to their place and their climate and their season in a lot of these homes. That is really powerful, even in urban areas. And it's not to romanticize it. It's just a fact. Like, you understand your climate better if you're sort of more reliant on the local climate to mediate or to make yourself comfortable. So,
yeah, that makes so much sense. And just something very related to that, which was when I was a real estate broker for a short period of time, in Israel, in actually where I had never really thought about this concept, but it kept coming up from people who were locals and they were trying to buy a new apartment or something. And they were looking for in apartment buildings, you have choices of, usually you don't have four sides open to windows. Usually we have like two or maybe three, depending on your side. So they wanted to make sure they had the right directions. They wanted south facing windows or north facing. And I was like always curious, but it had to do with, the sun coming in, throughout the day and getting, breeze from certain sides and areas. And that to me was just fascinating that I learned about at that time, which made so much sense, but had never really thought about it. But related to what you're saying, obviously people who are local and understand those things are going to want to design their homes with those features to capture that.
Right. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's amazing. Wow. So I'm just curious a little more. I'm very curious. There's so much you've done and so much that you do. If there's, the real estate investing side of it, that's come about over a long period of time, just over time, learning about real estate, being involved in real estate, having that idea. Is that something that you are continuously like pursuing, trying to find deals, or does it just come up like if you're designing in a certain area and you happen to look around like, oh, I like this area, maybe let's look around and see. Like, how do you invest as a strategy is really what I'm asking.
Well, I will say that it started off not as a strategy at all. It started off as a necessity. So I had bought a condo while I was right before grad school, and which was 2007. So that's great timing. So when I moved to Boston, I couldn't sell it. There was no way I could sell it. And it wasn't like the worst situation ever, but it wasn't good. So I was like, oh, I'll just rent it to my friends who are still in grad school. That's fine. So I'll live in Boston. I'll rent to some friends. Like, it'll be fine. Well, pretty soon, a year or two later, I didn't have as many friends because people had graduated out and I was in another state, whatever. So I was like, oh, I guess I'll advertise and like, I'll get some tenants that way. And I was like, okay, that sounds good. And then pretty soon I didn't have any connections anymore. And I was literally running this condo as an out-of-state landlord and like solving plumbing backups from 6 states away. Right. So I was like, oh, I can do this. So meanwhile, I was saving money to buy a place in Boston because I wanted to own my own place. So like, here's my rate of savings, like, putting away my nickels and dimes. Right. And like, here's the home values, like going up exponentially. Yeah. Like, there's no way I was ever going to catch up. So one day I woke up and I was like, where can I buy something? Like, I have some money. Where can I buy something? My hometown. So, where I have plenty of connections. So I bought a 2-family in my hometown and I didn't even see it in person. We did like a little Zoom thing and learned a lot about that.
About buying out of states, without seeing the property.
Yeah, exactly. So, whatever, like, I think business is like a combination of being both like, whatever, it'll be fine. And also like super, super dialed in and laser focused. And, it's like both of those things. So I learned about that. And then by that time I had helped my parents buy a 4-family. I was like, okay, like I'm sort of understanding like what's going on here. Then I was like, now I can sell my condo. We've reached the point where I can sell it. So then I was like, what's this 1031 everyone's talking about? I should probably learn about that. So I figured that out. And, I was just kind of doing it on my own. It was before I was on Twitter and knew all these retweet people. I was like kind of sort of Googling things on Bigger Pockets once in a while. I was like, well, how do I do this? So I 1031'd it into another 2-family and a single family and rehabbed one and got stuck in a COVID situation and dealt with that. And sewer lines blew up and, this and that, all the usual things. Sure. But so my strategy now is much more honed. So now I know which neighborhoods I want to be in. I know what I want to pay for a place. I know what I like. I know what matters to me as an investor and a property manager, and what I don't want to get stuck with in terms of like weird things. Like, I don't want to have units where you can't get to the basement without going through someone's unit. No brainer, but I bought one that you have to do that now. Every time I have to contact the thing and so the strategy now is much more honed. Now that I'm spending more time in Lancaster, the real strategy is going to kick in. So hopefully you heard it here first, but hopefully I'm going to hone that strategy even more and get more serious about putting together some deals and partnering and working on some of that stuff. getting my spreadsheets in order,
There you go. That's awesome. That's great to hear. I'm so happy for you kind of moving in that direction, because it is something that will help to, springboard your whole business and life in general. And it's amazing that oftentimes, and I hear this over and over again from people, when they're thinking about where should I invest? So the first places you should look are places that you're familiar with, either where you grew up or where you have lived or where you visit a lot or would like to visit a lot. And usually those are the places where it makes most sense to invest, because you have contacts there, because it makes sense. You've already been there. You understand the landscape. Whereas a total random place where it's like, even though it might be a great market, and there's opportunities, it may not be the best for you, because it will take a long time just to kind of get your feet planted in that place.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. Being in my hometown, obviously the buy-in was lower. So I was able to build a business in Boston and make Boston dollars and spend them in Lancaster. So that was helpful. But also, the long-standing connections here. Nothing beats network.
100%. That's awesome. Well, Marilyn, I want to transition to what we call the final four. These are 4 questions I ask all my guests. What's the worst job that you ever had?
Well, the worst job I ever had was, I alluded to this on Twitter at one time, but I had to clean out a crawl space so saturated by cat pee that I fell through the floor into said crawl space. And yeah, I had to clean that out. That was not fun.
Wow.
Yeah. That might be the worst.
Yeah. I mean, and as a contractor, you oftentimes have crazy jobs. I mean, crazy jobs that can come up from time to time, but that one definitely sounds at the top of the list, from what I've heard. So,
pretty bad.
There you go. Second question, what's a book you've read that's given you a paradigm shift?
Well, so this one's a tough one for me because I love to read. I have tons of books, but I'm going to go ahead and take it all the way back to the book that my company is named after. So my company is called Runcible Studios, which is a word that is actually coined in a children's poem or book called The Owl and the Pussycat. And when I was a little girl, it was the first book that I read. And the poem is beautiful and it says the word Runcible in it, which is name my company, but also the drawings were so beautiful. And they were all these buildings and all these interesting, little towns and stuff like that. And I love to imagine the life of everyone in there and what is it like to live in that house or walk down this street or whatever. So I think that was the beginning.
That's amazing. So it's not actually a real word, meaning it is a word because it appears in, poetry, but it's a fictional, basically word.
Yeah. I mean, basically, I think no marketing person would ever tell you to name your company after a made up word, I don't know, I guess Google did it and it worked out fine, but Runcible, people have tried to define it using context clues.
Right.
And the best is that it describes an object of utility and beauty. So I'm good with that. That works.
That's perfect for architect design company. Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. And it really, really out of the box answer there for a book that,
a children's book.
Exactly. Yeah. I think you're only the second person that has chosen a children's book as that book. We had, who was it? I'm blanking on his name here right now, but he chose a children's book, claiming that it was the only book he had actually ever read.
Oh, wow.
So that was good. But we'll get back to that. I'll try to figure out who that was for a second. I'm picturing his face and blanking on his name for right now for a second. Okay. Anyways, third question. What is a skill or talent that you would like to learn?
Well, so this kind of goes in hand with if someone asked me what superpower I would choose, if I could have any superpower, I wish I spoke other languages. Basically any language, I would be happy to speak. So, I mean, I learned German in high school. I know a little bit of German, but so a skill I would like to have maybe is learning languages or just having any other language. I just think it would be so awesome. And yeah, so my superpower would be, of course, because I'm just changing your question to make it into this other question.
Sure. Go for it.
That I would be able to speak any language and understand any language. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing?
That is amazing.
You know? So anyway, a skill it's one of the things I've done many, many things, but one thing that I'm very sad about is I did not keep up my German. So I wish I had that skill.
Well, you still can.
That's true. That's true. There's still time.
Yeah, there's plenty of time. And German is so very much related to English. It's actually, once you learn, a little deeper into it, it's of the easier languages to pick up once you're fluent in English.
Exactly.
Yeah. Go for it. And you've traveled to so many places also. So
it's true. I mean, when you speak English, though, it's such a crutch. You're able to get around in a lot of places. But everywhere I went, I tried to learn some phrases and, please and thank you and that kind of stuff and some phrases and stuff. But yeah.
Okay. Fourth and final question. What does success mean to you?
So success means, there's that famous quote that now I'm blanking on what it is. Wait, here it is. I'm going to grab it. It's right here.
Go for it.
It's an Emerson quote. It's right here. And I think I'm going to let him speak for me, which I don't often do, but he's got it. He says, to laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate beauty, to find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch. To know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded.
Wow. I think this is officially, we're going to name this episode Poetry and Architecture.
Will your audience want to listen to one called Poetry and Architecture?
Absolutely. No, this is great. This is awesome. And I love that. I love that quote. I've definitely seen that, read that before, but it really does hit on so many points that just drive so deep into the human psyche, into what we're really here in the world for. And I think that's, a lot of people get caught up in physicality and things that are mundane when there's so much more important things in life.
I agree.
Awesome. Well, finally, Marilyn, how can our listeners find you or reach out to you if they want to?
Well, they can find me probably easiest the way that we connected, which is on Twitter. So I'm at MW Moedinger on Twitter. There aren't many Moedingers in the world, so it's not hard to find me on there. And my company is runciblestudios.com. So you can visit our website and then you can check out our Instagram at Runcible Studios. But those are the best ways to reach. I'm basically behind all of those things. So if you send in a form or you send a DM or whatever, it's most likely going to be me who's responding. So I'd love to connect with everyone on Twitter and whatnot.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, we'll make sure to put all that in the show notes as well. So if anyone wants to click the little button that says information on wherever listening platform you're listening to, you will find all this information there. And I really just want to thank you again for joining me. This has really been awesome.
Well, thank you. It was fun to talk about a whole bunch of stuff and as well as business stuff.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, thank you guys for joining us all the way to the end once again. And remember, until next time, the best advice comes only when you ask.
Real quick, I have one question for you. Did you like this episode? If you did, I want to ask you a huge favor. See, the biggest thing that helps this podcast grow and that will spread this message to the whole world is that if you leave a review, a rating, and subscribe to the podcast. What that does is it basically tells the platforms that this podcast is out on is that you like my stuff and I'm doing something right. So take a few seconds out of your day, hit that subscribe button, leave a rating or review. I would be extremely grateful. Also, I want to hear from you guys. So I want to hear some feedback. If you have any questions for future episodes, please find me on LinkedIn. Send me a DM, connection request, Yona Weiss, and I'd love to hear from you.